Complexity is one of the central themes in your work. What does it mean in the context of creativity?
Complexity is actually synthesis. It's bringing together. So in order to study the lungs and the brain, people used to study cadavers, right? And they still do. So there's no life there. If you want to study the human body with life, you have to look at it as a system, totally interconnected. And that's historically not what we've been very good at. We've not been very good at dealing with complexity. We think that dealing with complexity means simplifying. But as we can tell from the example of the human body, that also means that you have to deal with a dead body.
What I've realized with music is that there's certain things, certain aspects that you can teach, and certain things that I feel you shouldn't try to teach. Because if you try to do that, the student would just start to imitate the teacher.
Our educational systems, it's like they're teaching kids how to read music and play other people's music, but they never teach kids how to make their own music. And they never teach kids to improvise. In the transdisciplinarity book, I pointed out that, once you sneak creativity in the door of academia, you have to bring subjectivity in, because the creative process demands an awareness of our own subjectivity.
Today, we're joined by Dr. Alfonso Montuori, a scholar whose work sits at the intersection of creativity, complexity, systems thinking, leadership, education, and human development. Throughout his career, Alfonso has challenged us to think beyond simple answers and rigid boundaries. Rather than viewing creativity as a rare talent possessed by a gifted few, he has explored creativity as a way of engaging with an increasingly complex and interconnected world. His work asks profound questions about how we create ourselves, how we participate in culture, how we navigate uncertainty, and how we can cultivate wisdom in times of rapid change. Alfonso has written extensively on creativity, transdisciplinarity, systems thinking, and transformative learning, and has been a leading voice in bringing complexity perspectives into creativity studies. In this conversation, we'll explore creativity not just as a process of producing new ideas, but as a lifelong journey of learning, self-creation, and meaning-making. We'll discuss complexity, education, identity, culture, and what it means to live creatively in a world that is often uncertain and constantly changing. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to the Creativity Dialogues, Alfonso. It's such a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I would like to get behind the person who has these ideas about creativity, about life. Tell us a bit about your life, your childhood. What experiences shape the way you see the world today?
I think a major factor was growing up in a number of different countries. My father was Italian, my mother was Dutch. When I was 6 months old, we moved to Beirut. Then when I was 5, we moved to Athens. And when I was 12, we moved to London. So that was a series of different cultures. And of course, we'd always go to the Netherlands and to Italy to see grandparents. So I think that was very important for me, just to see the very different ways in which people live their lives, in which cultures, everything from food to how close you can stand to somebody. There was just there were so many differences, and ultimately, I think I saw it as very much as what kind of culture are people creating. I saw these cultures not necessarily as, well, this is, I think if you're monocultural, you just tend to think, well, this is the way things are in my culture and sort of everywhere. But growing up in all these different cultures, I saw that people would create different worlds for themselves to live in, different cultures because of the history and so on, different kinds of food, um, uh, and different philosophies of life. So I think that was very
Yes,
important.
I feel exactly the same way because I actually I have rather a very similar background. I grew up in Africa. I was born in India, but then grew up and did my entire schooling in Nigeria. And then we moved back to India where I was probably for about 10 to 12 years before moving to the United States 24 years back.
Oh
So
yeah,
I
yeah,
totally understand what that experience is of living across different continents and cultures and just I feel it brings about such a different sort of openness because you
yes,
just see different cultures and I think you fundamentally understand that they're very similar in certain ways. At the humanistic level we're really
yes.
very similar, and yet in our traditions, our cultures, our ways of interacting, we could be very different.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, yeah. And I think there's lots of research that shows that the multicultural experience leads to more openness and also to creativity, and which
Mhm.
is, I think, rather easy to
Yeah,
understand because you are just exposed to so many different ways people do essentially the same things, right? Yeah, yeah.
exactly.
That's
Yeah, yeah. So, looking back, what first drew you towards questions of creativity, culture, and human development?
Well, I think music played a very big role for me there because living in London in the 70s, there was a huge musical explosion. And there were a lot of opportunities to perform. It was a economically difficult time, so pubs opened themselves up to bands. They said, "Well, let's try having some bands on to see if we can bring people into the pub, right? In this economically difficult time." But it just meant that there were so many different places to play, and music. The For me was very significant because there was just so much about music that sort of the idea of creating with others, right, and the idea that just that like a writer or a painter is staring at a white a screen or you're there's silence, and then what are you going to do with that silence? And it's all the result of people coming together. And actually, that was one of the things that later on for me was very interesting, is that I realized that when I later started actually looking at it more seriously in university, I realized that there was no research on groups, on creativity as interaction. There was just a focus on the lone genius, right? On the individual who is exceptionally
Mhm,
creative. But there was nothing about
mhm.
interactions. And when you're playing in a band, it's the interactions that are significant. When you're working with other musicians, it's there's something very. It can be magical, and it can also be very disappointing, depending. Just like any relationship, right? But the music is an emergent property of the interaction of the musicians, and that was completely not addressed in the 80s, 90s. There was still a lot of focus on individuals rather than interactions. But the
And
other thing is, in London in the 70s, there was a sort of a resurgence of nativism. There were political groups like the National Front and the British Movement that were explicitly racist. And I could see that because there were so many young people who were unemployed, they were getting swept up into these movements that gave them a sense of identity, a sense of a mission, sense of community. But at the same time, in the music world, there were bands with black and white musicians. On the one hand, I could see these people, these young people getting dragged into these racist movements, right-wing racist movements. And on the other hand, there were multicultural groups, kids of all backgrounds coming together to make music, to dance, and to be together, and that the creativity was bringing them together, right? And so for me, that was a very significant point, because later I became interested in studying authoritarianism and racism and so on. And if you look at the psychological profile of the creative person and the psychological profile of the authoritarian person, they're pretty much opposites, right? And so there's a real opportunity there in fostering creativity to also foster openness, appreciation of diversity, understanding other people, collaborating, and so that became a significant research interest of mine.
Right. And I'm so glad that you also brought up the idea of the lone genius, which we had before. I always wonder that how did things change? How did we start to think beyond that? Because currently, do you think it's because we started to develop other aspects like just creativity studies, for one? Because we didn't have the academic perspective until recently, till Guilford brought up the word in 1950. But before that, the academics just had to describe themselves, or people perceived them, sorry, the practitioners. And perhaps that's why the idea of the lone genius, the very special human. But today, creativity studies sort of really let us know that every human has creative potential. They may or may not choose to act creatively, but the potential exists in every human. Do you think that we changed our perceptions thanks to creativity studies, or how has this shift happened?
That's a great question. I mean, I remember in 1995, I co authored an article called Deconstructing the Lone Genius Myth, and arguing that, first of all, the
Mm,
genius is never really alone, but also that we should pay more attention to relationships, collaborations, and so on. And we were criticized quite heavily, and some people called me a
mm,
communist, which I thought was very interesting. And it took a while, I think, for it to happen. Yes, there was research that started going in that direction, focusing on groups. But what also happened is that in industry, um, there's they developed this focus with Silicon Valley on innovation. And innovation in organizations can't be dependent on one person only. It's a systemic process. And what that gave people was examples, because I think people needed examples. They needed examples because people would say, well, creativity is only an individual. What do you mean? And they would think of boring committees as examples of people working together, right? It's like, oh God, no, it's terrible. But really, when they were given examples of a jazz band or a theater production or a movie or an R&D lab or innovation in organization, people started thinking, "Oh, okay, now I get it." Because I think Hollywood had always had these movies like Amadeus or Bird, or movies always about lone individuals, but never about groups, never about collaboration. So this
mm-hmm.
didn't exist in the social imaginary. When more and more people started becoming aware of, well, yes, look, when you go and listen to a band, or when you go watch a movie, you see this incredibly long list of people. It's not just Francis Ford Coppola or whoever. He didn't do the whole thing on his own. A lot of other people are involved in making a movie. And I think gradually people started to understand that uh, the creativity involves other people as well, and collaborative creativity can be
Yes.
fascinating and important.
Um, was there any particular book or thinker or experience that fundamentally changed your trajectory from the beginning?
I think the work of Frank Barron was very significant for me. He was one of the early creativity researchers, and he was a psychologist and a well-respected psychologist, but he would also draw on poetry and literature and philosophy. And psychologists didn't really like that very much. You're supposed to stick to your lane and kind of just do psychology, don't draw on too many other fields. But he was very eclectic, very fascinating. And he also pointed me in the direction of this relationship between creativity and authoritarianism. And also creativity, not just as having a bright idea, but as a way of being in the world. So something that sort of permeates everything we do, everything we are, and that can manifest in our everyday relationships, our everyday activities, our interactions with our family, with our coworkers. So it became how you are in the world rather than just a flash of inspiration, right? Because there was very much seen that way before. The light bulb goes over your head. Okay, that's creativity. But this other approach was more like a way of being in the world that was all about again, openness, and in some ways also improvisation, being able to respond in the moment, right? And so the root of the word improvisation is the Latin improvisus, which means unforeseen. So improvisation means being able to deal with the unforeseen, but also generate something unforeseen. Because if you and I are speaking and everything I tell you is something that you already know, it's a little boring. It's more interesting if I tell you things you go, oh, well, I hadn't foreseen that one, right? So improvisation for me is very important. There's sort of that being creative in the moment, embodied in life, right?
Do you think your jazz background sort of helps cultivate that?
Absolutely, yeah, because jazz really is all about improvisation, and also improvisation with other people. So for me, that was definitely a big part of. So I came to academia with that background, with that mentality, and actually didn't see that in academia. So I started saying, we need to pay attention to this. This is an interesting area of research. And I think more than ever, particularly given the fact that the world is so unpredictable these days. I think we all need to develop more improvisational skills. And I've also argued for
Yes.
that in the context of education, because our educational systems, it's like they're teaching kids how to read music and play other people's music, but they never teach kids how to make their own music, and they never teach kids to improvise. It's just like you follow the thing, and of course, kids are bored. I was bored in
Yeah.
school. It needs to be
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
alive and
I think,
relevant to the moment.
if it's in regards to music, I sometimes think it also depends on the form because certain forms enable that. Like
Yes.
I sing a form of Indian classical music, which is called khayal. So we basically have scales, and the complete music is improvised. So I actually tried a bit of an experiment with a jazz standard "Summertime," and I
Yes.
combined it with an Indian raga.
Oh,
And so it was
fantastic.
pretty interesting because we have the same notes, like sa re ga ma pa da ni sa, which is do re mi fa sol la ti do, but we just have a different sort of name for it. So this
Right.
fit summertime fit perfectly with the key. Sa ga ma da ni sa, summertime, and the living is easy. Fish are jumping, and the cotton is high. Sa ni da ni sa ga ma da da ni sa ga ma ga sa. Summertime, and the living is easy. So it, just by
Fantastic.
combining different things, I felt that it's fun to just kind of fuse and try some fusion experiments.
Absolutely. Yes. That sounds wonderful. You should record that. There. Are you in Los Angeles?
Hmm. If Well,
Plenty
I'm
of.
actually right now in Seattle, but
Oh,
I do visit. Yeah.
yeah. Well, Seattle has lots of great musicians too. Yeah. No. Yeah.
Hmm.
So what you just said here, I mean, I think is fascinating because really with jazz, of course, it's the same kind of principle, scales and chords and yeah, and we don't teach people to do that. We don't give people a sense that that's a possibility,
Yeah.
and that this is part of everyday life that can be applied to everything. It can be applied to everything. I mean, obviously, music provides a fantastic
Yes.
example, but the principles are are valid throughout our lives, right?
Right. And I think the one problem is, we can teach skills, we can teach skills, but it's very hard to teach creativity because that's something so original and personal that just the way you would see a note or just the combinations that come to your mind, they would have to be true to the individual. So, what I've
Right,
realized with music is that there's certain things, certain aspects that you can teach, and certain things that I feel you shouldn't try to teach. Because if you try to do that, the student would just start to imitate the teacher and they would
right.
lose, whatever was coming naturally to them. So I think to have those two aspects uh, involved is really where creativity emerges, where you improvise and then you do have certain and fixed aspects and your own skill that you build up over time, which shows up.
Yeah, it's a very interesting dance, isn't it? Because Charlie Parker, who was one of the great innovators in jazz, he in the beginning he was memorizing solos by Lester Young, and a lot of these musicians then focused on learning what other people were doing, but then after that would try to develop a better sound sense of what they were hearing in their heads. All right. So yeah, I think the whole
Yeah.
phenomenon of creativity. I think what you're referring to actually, besides the technical things that you might learn from studying somebody else's solo, it requires introspection and being aware of what we're hearing in our
Yes.
head, what we would like,
Hmm.
what matters to us, what our aesthetic values are, and so on. And sadly, that's
Hmm.
also
Hmm.
something that introspection is also something that we don't get in schools, but I think it's essential.
Yeah,
And I just put
it
out this
is.
new book on transdisciplinarity, and my argument is, the way that we present academia is very sort of focused on the objective and the method and rationality and logic. And we don't talk about creativity. We don't talk about feelings. We don't talk about values. All these things are left out. But the bottom line is
Mhm.
AI is going to be doing all the other stuff, all the logical, methodical stuff with no problem and probably a lot better than we are. So
Right.
it's pushing us now to say we need to introduce creativity. We need to introduce values and feelings and people's actual lives in education and research, because otherwise AI can do it all for us. So AI, in that sense, is a push for us to step up, right?
I completely agree with this because I feel that we're going to need creativity more than anything else in our
Absolutely, yeah.
coming times. So
Yeah.
that's really what it is. You've worked across many different disciplines, and you've resisted staying within one intellectual box. How do you handle all these different dimensions, aspects simultaneously?
That's a great question. Yeah, it's not really that I've resisted. I think I've been unable to, just because my mind is. I don't start in the same way that I don't belong to one culture. I don't belong to one discipline. For me, what I look for, if there's a phenomenon I want to understand, I don't start with a discipline. I start with what is the phenomenon and how can I best approach it. And it doesn't matter if I draw from Italy or France or Germany or Nigeria or Japan, right? The equivalent. So if
Right. Mm-hmm.
psychology or sociology or anthropology, whatever is pertinent, is what I'm interested in. And it's not always easy in the sense that people who do that, who tend to be more inter or transdisciplinary, they can also be sort of. I was going to use the word homeless, but I should say unhoused academically. In the sense that
Mm-hmm.
we're viewed as sort of weird hybrids and don't really belong anywhere. But I think there's much more openness to that these days, because people are realizing that you can't solve complex problems through only one discipline. Life
Mm-hmm.
doesn't fit into a neat discipline. And so we need to draw on whatever is relevant. Um, so that's one of the
Yes.
things that I'm interested in, and that's the most recent book. Yeah, so it's really all about bringing creativity and complexity into the research process. So I mean, it's for academics.
Right. So, because I've wondered that how can the common layperson sort of understand this aspect? Because I've observed that people want to be in their comfort zones, that I'm really good at this, I've worked hard at this. And so they're rather reluctant to step into new territories and then try to own them all or be comfortable with really not knowing. Do you feel that this is one of the reasons why they aren't really able to be creative? Because for that there's a certain openness which is needed, and if you have a box that you've positioned yourself, then you're very limited because every perception is just drawn from that one box. And the
Yes.
more the different dimensions that you bring, it helps you, but then you have to have the courage to be far more open, strong, and willing to fail, which I think really scares people.
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, there's so much in what you just said. So Rollo May wrote a book called "The Courage to Create," right? And so there is
Hmm.
that aspect of uh, also just standing out and saying something that people say, "Well, what the hell is he talking about?" All right, people won't immediately understand it, and also the box may be limiting, but it's my box, and I'm the king of the box, right? And so there is a certain amount of, you see that with academics. I know everything about my topic, and I'm the,
Wisdom?
but
Yes.
but then it also means that if I wander into territory where I don't know much, right? Then I become more vulnerable, and I'm not the king anymore. And it's something that can be tough for some people, and also it's a lot of
Hmm.
work. right? Because you have to learn about this other
Exactly.
field, and it's
Yes.
like, I'm just going to stay in my box. Thank you very much. Now, you
Yes.
said
Yes.
also about the average person, which I think is a really interesting question, because I'm sure you've heard people say, well, go out and do your own research. And I've done my research about this topic. But, research is not something, it doesn't mean just looking something up on Google. Uh, Research is a
Exactly.
is a
Exactly.
is a serious topic, and it's very today particularly. It's so easy to be misled, and there are so many wild claims out there, and people trying to sort of disinformation and so on. So I actually think it's really
Mhm.
important for people to have a better sense of the fundamentals of how to do research, not in one discipline, because the average person doesn't live in one discipline. So, how does the average person confronted with a question, how can they go out and research it in a way that has integrity, that is solid, that it's not just, oh, I'll go with the people that I agree with, right? So that's
Yes.
a big question.
I'm doing my PhD now, and everything that you just said resonates so strongly with me because that's how I've had to keep my approach that it's not just reading, it's not just the literature review, but also since I'm doing a practice-based PhD, I'm able to use a phenomenological approach where my music is involved too. And so many different dimensions, case studies. So there's
Yes.
such a wide spectrum.
Oh, fantastic. So tell me, what are you doing your
Yeah.
PhD on?
So my PhD topic is I am fighting to redefine creativity because I feel that the current standard definition, which is of novelty and value, is
Yes.
a completely outsider's perspective. It's an academic perspective, which is involved with just the product, which is novelty, is this new, is it something we haven't seen before? And then usefulness, does the market really like this? Is it useful? Is it solving a problem? Which is all good, but it's an outsider's perspective. I feel that the practitioner, the creator, has, I mean, his intrinsic motivations or why he does something, all the challenges that are encountered, how that initial idea changes, transforms. None of that is accounted for in the current definition. So, if the current standard definition. So, that's what I felt. I felt that the field actually really lacks first principles. And that's why there are so many myths on the topic of creativity. If this one thing was really added in, it could perhaps help to streamline the other
Yes.
aspects. By completely taking the creator out, it's an incomplete definition,
Yes.
according to
Yes.
me.
Oh, that's
So,
fantastic. Well, I'd love to read what you're working on. And yeah, and so for instance, for me also, one of the things that I found troubling was, the PPP, right? Person, process, product, right? Which was the old way
yeah,
sort of
the four
framing the
P's. Yeah,
research. Right. And then
yeah,
later became P's with, press, which I thought was always a little sketchy. But the
yes,
person,
yeah,
really, they're
yeah,
talking about the who of creativity. But if the who of creativity is a person, it's no wonder they weren't looking at relationships, right? Because the who is creative was always
exactly.
a person, it was never a relationship, you know.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
that
And
sort of
also,
cut
when they
off.
say person, they never really specify.
Right.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
they never specify when you say person, exactly what are we talking about?
Yeah.
It's very, very basic. So I feel that the four P's did one thing useful. It's like they're the basic alphabet, like the ABCs,
Yes.
that they put in certain very basic structures in place. But it's just the alphabet. It doesn't even create the real word. Leave aside the sentence. So,
Yeah.
so it's a good beginning point, but it doesn't really convey. the picture, so to speak.
Yes, yes. Oh, it's fantastic. Well, I'm delighted to hear that you're doing your research, your dissertation on this. I really look forward to reading it.
Thank you so much. I will share with you. How do you define creativity? I'd really be interested in knowing.
Well, that's a very big question. You just mentioned the sort of the more traditional definition. I think, as I said, for me, it's also very much a way of being in the world, really. A way of being in the world that is
Yes.
associated with openness, with presence in the moment, and ability to improvise, to create in the moment. I mean, and when we talk in religious terms, we talk about a creator, we talk about creatures, we talk about creation, so that connects us to sort of the more spiritual dimension of creativity, which is traditionally left out of sort of the psychological research. But there's also so this spiritual dimension, I think, is more closely related to this idea of how we embody creativity in the moment, right? And so that then asks a lot of questions like, what are we creating? I mean, creativity is wonderful, but what are we creating, and are we taking responsibility for what we create, right? Because I could, right now, all this, there's a huge focus on technology, creativity, technology, but it seems to me that most of our problems originate in human beings and the way human beings interact. So, can we apply our creativity to our own humanity and elevating, if you will, our humanity to go
Yes.
beyond these sort of primitive impulses to acquire as much money and power as we can? Right. So I think a more complex, open view of creativity can certainly be a direction to move into, and give us a broader understanding of what matters, right?
Absolutely. And is this what you'd call transformational creativity?
Transformational creativity, I think that's something that Sternberg, it's a term Sternberg is using. So I don't want to say that it is, because I confess that I'm not familiar enough with with transformational, the way he's using it yet. I haven't looked into that carefully yet. But yeah, there's definitely a dimension there that has to do with personal transformation. Absolutely, absolutely, and this idea of self
Mhm.
creation, right? The idea of we are creating ourselves, right, and we are
Yes.
creating our relationships, and so that gives us the opportunity to
Yes.
transform
Yes.
what is already, right.
People somehow tend to associate creativity with artists. I mean, it's that if you're a singer, a musician, a painter, an actor, a dancer, it's as if you're automatically creative. And the other fields are not really thought of as creative. Why do you think this misconception?
um, yeah, that's been around for a very long time. I mean, it really started with the Renaissance, and I think in the sciences, if you're Einstein, maybe you're considered creative, but not that much. So it was definitely situated exclusively in the arts, and I think that's changing. I think that's changing a little bit. Because I mean, it was really just sort of a historical phenomenon because of the Renaissance. But I think now people are starting to understand that creativity is broader, but we still have a very limited definition, because now it sort of tends to be more associated with creating new apps and technology. It still doesn't. It's not
Yeah.
viewed in
Mhm.
terms of self cultivation, self creation, creating human relationships, and so on.
I think also that when it comes to the arts, there's this idea, because I found it so contradictory. I have so many friends who are musicians, who are painters. Um, they do different kinds of work with their hands, but I wouldn't just call them creative. I mean, some of them are just copying, producing the same identical work. And so I think that many of them aren't creative at all. And then there are people who are trying out something new, experimenting, and they don't belong to the field of the arts, but I feel they're truly creative.
Yeah, I mean, I think the assumption that just because I play a few chords on the guitar, that means, oh, you're creative, it's absolutely not correct. That's just sort of a stereotype. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think as you pointed out, our understanding of creativity and our definition of it, I think right now is in the process of changing, but still needs a lot of work. Because one of the other things that happens in the
Yes.
example that you gave
Hmm.
is that standards completely drop, right? It's just because I play an instrument and
Yeah,
then that makes me creative. But maybe I just play a few chords that I learned from a book. That doesn't really qualify
exactly.
as real creativity, right? Yeah.
Hmm. What do you think are the biggest misconceptions people have about creativity? I mean, certainly this is probably one.
So the other one is the lone genius.
Yes. Hmm.
Um, and I think another one is you've either got it or you don't. I think there are people with unusual talents. So people who, by the time they're 6 years old, are doing incredible things on an instrument, uh, and musicians with people who have incredible aptitudes. But even that doesn't necessarily mean that just because you started off brilliant, you'll actually be able to have a career and be able to produce um, something significant, because a lot of it has to do with the environment as well. If you're in an environment that doesn't support creativity, uh, I mean, I often use this quotation from Hans Eysenck, the British psychologist, who basically stated that genius is exclusively the province of men for whatever reason. And there's a lot wrong with that, of course. And also that as a psychologist, I think then he would say, well, there must be, if there is a reason, let's look at are women not motivated enough? Is it their brain? Is it their personality? Whatever. But you have to look at the social conditions. Women weren't allowed to go to university, weren't allowed to perform in public, weren't, there were so many things that the environment prevented them from doing. How do you expect somebody to get a Nobel Prize if they're not allowed to be physicists at the highest level, right? And I think
Correct.
environments. One of the other myths is that if you're a genius, you'll be discovered and you'll rise to the top. That's total nonsense. That's total nonsense, because then you can comfortably say, well, and look, genius will rise to the top no matter what. And look, coincidentally, the majority of the Nobel Prize winners are white men. So everybody had a fair chance, but only the white guys made it. No, it's nonsense. It's nonsense. It's the conditions did not
Mhm.
support people to express their creativity. So there's that part, which sort of in the Nobel Prize region.
I also always wondered that in creativity, are there words that I think we need more new words to be able to, everything gets put under one box of creativity. Like, for example, what's the difference between creativity and innovation? Because a lot of people just replace either of the word. And I mean, because I think creativity has not yet been awarded a very distinct identity. And that's why I've always
Yeah.
wondered that what exactly is the separation? What is innovation and what is creativity?
Right, right. Well, the way it's sort of in the more business end of the world, they creativity is associated with individuals and innovation with getting a product from idea to market, right? So I can be very creative, but innovation is when my product has made its way to the market and is something again new and useful, but through a longer process, right? Yeah.
Complexity is one of the central themes in your work. What does it mean in the context of creativity?
In the context of creativity, so if we think about the way that sort of the dominant paradigm for inquiry, let's say, is, or when we say, when we talk about good thinking, it's analysis, right? And analysis means breaking things down to their most basic components so that they can be studied, right? But in doing that, we study things that have already been created. So there's a process of simplification. We break everything down. There's the human body, and we look at the lungs, and we look at the brain, and we look at the blah blah blah. But complexity is actually synthesis. It's bringing together. It's looking. So in order to study the lungs and the brain, and the people used to study cadavers, right? And they still do, right? So there's no life there. If you want to study the human body with life, you have to look at it as a system, totally interconnected. And that's historically not what we've been very good at. We've not been very good at looking at whole systems. We've not been very good at dealing with complexity. We think that dealing with complexity means simplifying. But as we can tell from the example of the human body, that also means that you have to deal
Yes.
with a dead body, right? And so complexity for me is important. So how can we study the whole person and the whole person in their larger context, right? Uh, um, which is historically not something that's been done in the psychology of creativity. Psychology of creativity studies, draws a line around the person and says that's what we'll study. But Ravenna Helson, the great creativity researcher, said to study the creativity of women, we need to look at the larger social context. We need to look at how that affects who they are, what that does to them, and get a much richer picture. One last thing about that, Frank Barron did some research at the San Francisco Art Institute with artists there, and particularly interesting research on the differences between men and women. And the men all said, if I can't do art, I'll die. My life will be over. And the women said, art is very important for me, but I have my family, I have my friends, blah, blah, blah. And so the normal assumption would be, say, look, the men are 100% passionate about it, and they'll be the one who'll be the great artists, and the women, for them, it's more like a hobby, right? But when they gave the
Mm.
paintings of the men and the women to be judged anonymously by, competent art critics, they found that the women were just as good as the men, right? And so there are different ways
Mm.
of experiencing creativity and viewing yourselves, and there is this myth that oh, if I don't do art, I'm going to die. Oh, it's everything, and yeah, but that's not necessarily what it has to be, you know. And so again, that's a more holistic view of the artist, right? But in our culture, because there is that myth of the lone
Yes.
genius, in a garret and doesn't sleep and maybe drinks and takes drugs or whatever, right? People think, well, that must be better, right? That must be better. But
And can you explain that myth? Because it's so true that people think that, you can do things without learning. And I think that the difference in that is that it's almost impossible. It's just that somebody may not go to a formal school and learn, but they would have taught themselves in some way.
right, um, in among artists, there's this saying, "Don't let them see you sweat." Right. So if you're playing something difficult, don't let them see
Oh.
that it's difficult. Just like in Italian, there's a term sprezzatura, which means doing something really difficult but making it
Ah.
look easy, right? And that builds on the myth, right, that I'm an extraordinary person. I can do this,
Yes.
and I could just. Whereas the average person would be, oh my God, it must be like
Pull it
it's
off.
crazy. Like, how do you do that? And
Yes.
so
Yes.
artists have played into that whole mythology of I'm a natural genius and I'm not like you. Also because it Paul McCartney. Well, actually, the difference. Mozart used to say that things just came into him in a flash, and that boom, there was this. He would have a piece of music completely in his head, whereas Beethoven, we know from looking over his music, he was always changing and rewriting and doing things, and so I think people would think, oh well, Mozart is the genius because it just came to him in a dream, like Paul McCartney. He got the song Yesterday. He woke up and the song Yesterday was in his head. And people think, well, he's Paul McCartney. That never happens to me. But what they don't know is he only got one small part of it. And the rest he had to borrow from a song he'd already written. But people don't want to hear about that. They want to hear about, oh, it came to him in a flash, because it's sexier. It's like, oh, he's special. He's Paul McCartney.
Mm-hmm.
But people
Mm-hmm.
work really hard. And I think that's it's, you can understand it, but it's disempowering. Because people say that never happens to me.
Yes.
He's a genius. I'm not. Well, he works really hard too. Beethoven, and also we found later that Mozart also reworked his music a lot. It's just he just hid it. We didn't get to see it until later that he was actually reworking his music. So, so this is another one of the myths that makes people feel like, well, maybe that's not me, creative.
No, and that's why I've realized that you shouldn't really go to somebody else to ask them exactly how they did something. Because, for one, it's not necessary that they would be able to articulate their process exactly.
Right.
And
Yeah.
also that creativity, the conditions keep changing. So even if you were to follow somebody else's exact plan, you most likely wouldn't get exactly the same results because you're
Exactly.
a different person. And perhaps
Exactly.
even that same person, if they had to start again, they might change their methods, might change the way that they do things. So I always feel that you can never, ever really copy somebody else's way of doing things. It wouldn't.
Yeah.
It would not really produce good
Wouldn't
results,
work.
and it
No.
would kill one's own individual and unique way of doing things.
Right. Right. And I think that also may be something that stops people because it requires introspection. It requires understanding yourself. It requires spending time thinking, how about your own process, right? And people aren't very good at that in general because nobody ever tells us how to do it, right? And so yeah, I think absolutely there is this very subjective dimension of creativity that involves self-reflection and so on. That is very, very important. We have to understand ourselves in the creative process. Um, and this is also why
Yes.
in the transdisciplinarity book I pointed out that once you sneak creativity in the door of academia, you have to bring subjectivity in, because the creative process demands an awareness of our own subjectivity, right?
Yes, totally. One of the themes that runs through your work is that nothing exists in isolation, which you have been mentioning. Um, why is systems thinking so important?
Systems thinking, I think, is one of the things that it does in ways that are relatively accessible to sort of the Western mind, is that it emphasizes that interconnectedness and gives people ways to understand it and study it. So, in that sense, it's pretty foundational. And what's interesting is that systems theory has actually been very successful in Europe and in other countries, less so, arguably, in the United States, because it tends to be a more individualistic country. The U.S. focuses very much on the individual, and that's a great thing. And at the same time, there's a lack of understanding of the relational systemic dimension of a lot of phenomena. We immediately go for the individual. So, in that sense, it's a way to begin to understand phenomena that have been addressed in some of the indigenous traditions, in Buddhism. There's a wonderful book by Joanna Macy, The Dharma of Natural System, where she has one chapter of Buddhist dependent co-arising, and then one chapter of systems theory, and sort of shows the parallels between the two. But it's not surprising, I think, that indigenous scholars, Buddhist scholars, and so on, Haridas Chowdhury, who was the founder of the university where I teach, and brought Aurobindo's integral yoga to the West, also talks about systems theory, because they all found that it resonated with a different perspective that was not as individualistic, or certainly not individualistic, without losing the individual. It really focused on interconnectedness and thinking in a different way.
You've written about self creation and narrative. How do our stories shape who we become?
That's a great question. I think we all tell ourselves stories about who we are and about the world, and very often those stories have a really fundamental impact on who we are and how we behave in the world. And I think it's important to have an understanding of where those stories came from, and even whose stories they are, because they may be other people's stories about us and other people's stories about the world. So I think in that sense, the whole idea of self-creation and narrative is sort of to take creative responsibility, if you will, for our stories, and seeing, well, what is this a story that reflects my values, my purpose, who I am, how I see myself in the world. Because socialization really provides us with all these stories about how the world is and who we are. And again, as we were saying earlier, being exposed to other cultures, other people, really gives us a sense that the stories can be a lot more malleable, and that they can be changed.
Yes, I was about to ask you a question which probably is an extension of this, that is there such a thing as an authentic self, or are we constantly evolving?
Well, that's a great philosophical question there. Yeah, I'm not sure if I would agree that there is somewhere sort of an authentic self. I think we can be authentic, and we can come from a place that in that moment is authentic. Is there an authentic self somewhere? I don't know. I really don't know. I think we are constantly evolving and changing, and what constitutes authentic may be different at various points in time. What I maybe felt as authentic when I was 15, I wouldn't feel authentic now, you know? And so it's certainly not the same
Mhm.
authentic self in that sense. I'm curious what you think of that.
Yes, I do think that there are certain values and principles which often we retain and hold on to that
Mm,
form a core fundamental personality.
mm,
But
mm,
a
mm.
lot of our knowledge and understanding about things and in relation to other things do keep evolving. But there is an instinct which really stays with us throughout. That has been my observation when I look back at my life, that it's probably a combination of both, but there is just a strong an instinct, an impulse, a way of perceiving, which I've never found that has ever changed. But
Mm.
in terms of viewing the world, things have kept evolving.
Mhm. Yes, yes, yes. And if I'm understanding you correctly, there seems to be this sort of constant interaction between the two in a way, right? Um,
Yes, yes,
so they're sort
absolutely.
of co-evolving.
And also, there a certain idea about the self. I think that we are authentically who we are, but sometimes it's from the outside that we get more clarity about who we truly are,
Mm,
because we have
mm,
at times have certain illusions about ourselves, and
mhm.
sometimes the outside world really helps to point out things to us about ourselves that perhaps we're avoiding, uh,
Yes,
or that we don't want to accept. So,
yes, yes, yes. Yeah, it's very true.
I've always wondered that why are there so many different conflicting ideas that different domains have about creativity? Do you have some thoughts about this? That they're often talking past each other, or it's very hard to get a sense of just the domain of creativity?
Yes. I mean, one of the reasons I think is specialization. So you have personality psychology, you have cognitive psychology, you have Jungian approaches, you have Freudian approaches, and they all have interesting things to say. But the picture does then tend to get a little fragmented. Um, and one of the reasons that I put this book together is because I feel that what's needed more than one of the things that's most needed right now is what I call integrative transdisciplinarity. So it's a perspective that integrates the existing material, the existing research in many different disciplines, many subdisciplines, and uh, even within psychology, right? All this different research, and very often people don't even read each other, you know. They only read what happens in their
Yeah, yeah,
subdiscipline. They only read in personality psychology, but not in something
exactly.
else. And so you end up with this fragmentation, but there's no overall picture. And so very often when I see popular books about creativity, I just see the same old things about creativity, and yet the field has been going now for 75 years at least, and there's a lot of research out there, but it's just buried in these journals, and there's nobody really integrating it in any significant way. And I think
Exactly.
that's
Yes,
that's the big thing to do now is we need to start integrating, and not just integrating to have like the theory of everything, but integration with a view to application. So, what does this mean for me in my life? And there's lots of research that's very relevant. but not to create the theory of everything, blah blah blah, but just
Yes.
that's related to, actual life, if you will.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said just now because when I began my research and I started really reading, it was very interesting to learn that there's so much that has been written about creativity. But I found that each person had picked up a particular topic or a subject, and then their only focus was that one dimension. And there was great research in that one area. But the problem was every time I'd read one article, one book, I'd feel a sense of dissatisfaction. I'd feel that
Hmm.
they're trying to imply that this one thing is what creativity is. And so I
Right.
realized that everybody was kind of that one tree, but we never got the picture of the forest. And so
Right.
each tree claims that I'm the forest, but that's just not possible. So this connecting of the dots is what hasn't happened in the field of
Exactly.
creativity. We have really good individual trees, but we're unable to see. It's like a jungle, and we're unable to really just see the forest for what it is. So
Yes,
I think that's because the field lacks first principles.
I completely agree. Yeah, yeah. It lacks first principles, and it lacks a systematic effort at integration. Also, because we're not preparing scholars to do integration. We're preparing them for specialization. We're not preparing them for
Mhm.
integration. And there's still
Yes.
skepticism towards
Yes.
integration. All right. Um,
Yes.
yeah,
And I think many people hesitate to own that because they're scared that people will retaliate against me if I try to, say that this is how it should be. So it's a bit of a challenging position to hold.
it is. It is. Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes not a very popular one.
Yes. Yes. Um, So, as we move towards the end, Alfonso, I was wondering that how do you think that social media, I mean, the world of ready-made, how do you think that that has impacted the way we think and thereby creativity?
Yeah. I was just listening to a song somebody was playing, funky song with funny lyrics and good sounding voices. The whole thing was AI. Just created in 2 minutes by putting in a few prompts.
Yes.
Um, and It was not a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination. But I think things are changing very rapidly. And it's almost like the shift from just when recording equipment was developed. That changed things quite drastically as well. And in this case, I think as you point out, it will change our understanding of creativity. Um, Again, as I said with the example of academia, I think AI will be able to put together remarkable things. And at the same time, one of the reasons why people listen to music is because of the way it makes them feel and think and reflect. And it's a larger issue than just some sounds. You know, and I still think that that sort of thing can only be done by human beings. Um, and in the same way that people say, well, how are you going to deal with students and grade them now that there's I think the obvious and time consuming thing is oral exams. Can you stand here and talk to me about this in a way that makes sense? Or do is everything in your paper from AI and you don't actually even necessarily understand it? And I think the same is going to be with music. I hope that there will be a return to live music, to the focus on live music without
Yes.
AI and other gadgets, where we are really dealing with the performer in the moment as a human being. And I hope there will be
Yes.
a return
Yes.
to an appreciation of those kind of values, so that music doesn't have to be, this huge performance that you can only see on a video or something. But there will be a return to an appreciation to musicians and an audience live in the moment, because that's a thrill and an exchange that is really important and really rare. And I'm afraid, with all the technology, a lot of young people are not being exposed to it. So I hope it'll come back.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, even though with AI we may have, it might be perfect, but I think we crave those human imperfections and
Yes.
the unexpected quality which
Yes.
happens when the human is involved. And because exactly what you said happened to me recently. I heard some music that sounded beautiful and I was like, wow, this is so nice, till someone told me that it's AI and it isn't. I mean, it isn't, there's no real person. And I was surprised as to how instantly I just lost interest. It was as if this isn't even something real. I want to feel the pain, just the different emotions that one goes through when they create something. So if that's missing, I just don't feel connected to that piece of music.
Exactly.
And so I think
Exactly.
these are the things that need to happen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Alfonso, I think that this conversation has been so precious and so special because I feel we both really think alike. And so,
Yes.
when the wavelength matches, it's just so easy to feel that connection. And I feel I could continue speaking to you like the whole day because there's just so much here. But thank you so much for coming here today and sharing your views and for this really insightful conversation.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed it, and I hope we'll be able to stay in touch and send me some of your work. I'd love to read anything that you've written or are working on, because it sounds like you're doing some fascinating research.
I will. I will. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.